Our first session is titled East Meets West. Now, this is a panel discussion which will delve into the unique cultural dynamics and workplace nuances that foreign esports professionals encounter here in Korea. We're going to explore the strengths and weaknesses of the Korean esports industry, examining its competitive edge, and identifying areas where it can further improve to attract and, importantly, retain international talent. Let me first introduce our moderator for this panel, Yoo Jung-an, President of the Norwegian Esports Federation. 금방 부탁드립니다. Round of applause. You look fabulous. Please take a seat. Thank you. She will be joined by our panelist, Wolf Schroeder, commentator at LCK Global. He's coming in. He's somewhere. Hello, good morning. Dan Stamenkowski, commentator at Artosis. And the final panelist is me, Laura McCluckey, broadcaster and entertainer here in Korea. 반갑습니다.
Good morning, everyone. Woo! Okay, so we're going to do a quick introduction on myself and then everyone else here. We're going to talk a little bit about the work they've done here in Korea and how they have perceived coming here to Korea and working for many years. So my name is An Yu-jung, or my Norwegian name is Elin Yu-jung Moen, and I'm the president of the Norwegian Esports Federation. So it's not about me, but it's about all these lovely people here. So let's start with you, Wolf.
Hi, my name is Wolf Schroeder. I'm an esports commentator. I've been commentating esports in Korea since 2011, so I've lived here for about 13 years. And I do a lot of stuff outside of esports as well. I work in the food business a little bit, but my main job is to analyze and commentate games, and I'm currently working primarily on the LCK.
Hey, I'm Dan Stemkowski, better known as Artosis. I was a pro gamer in StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, and Hearthstone. I moved to Korea in 2008 to become a commentator and lived here until 2022, where I moved to Canada.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura McCluckey. I am a broadcaster and journalist and entertainer here in Korea. I've been in broadcasting and journalism for, you can't tell, but 22 years, almost 23 years. So I started when I was 5, 6. And what I do here in Korea is I work on television in radio broadcasting, and I've been here for about 13 years, same as Wolf. And I'm not directly involved in esports outside of with the IESF for these hosting events. However, I'm excited to kind of share our different perspectives on life in Korea.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of young people, they really look up to Korea and they want to come here and work and start a career and just delve into everything here. So how did you guys make up your minds to come here, and how did it all start? Wolf?
I think maybe Dan should start because he did what I did, but a little bit faster.
Yeah, so I was a top StarCraft player in North America for a long time. And, you know, I always watched Korean esports, the old KESPA days with OGN and MBC, and just fell completely in love with the Korean esports scene. So around 2004, I decided that it was my life's goal to move to Korea to make a life in esports. It took me about 4 years after that, and I was hired by IEG, which is now SPO TV, and they brought me over to do commentary in 2008. From there, you know, I worked with them for a few years, lived with the Korean pro team that they had at the time, and did a lot of commentary, and then eventually I moved over to GOM TV for the GSL, which became the longest running esports show of all time, and I casted that for about 12 years. Eventually it moved over to Afrika TV, now Soup. I still work with them, but at this point now I have moved to Canada with my family. I have a big family, so that made a lot of sense for me. But I still do a lot of professional commentary, and I'm back in Korea for things like this.
So I was trying to become like a professional StarCraft player while I was in college, but I was high ranked, but I wasn't like as good as Dan, for example, who's actually a pro player. Excuse me. And I started to realize that maybe commentary was something that I could do. So ultimately, I started commentating my own tournaments from my apartment in Georgia, in Atlanta, where I'm from. And then I applied for a job to work at GOM TV, where Artosis was already working. And because they were doing a lot of shows at the time, they needed some people to do some of the other like lower level tournaments that they were running at the time. So they actually hired me to move to Korea. So I was very excited. I dropped out of school to move here. I was in my second year of university, which made my parents very stressed out, and they were not happy about it. But I told them, you know, if it doesn't work out, I'll come back. They were like, oh, you'll be back in 3 months. And I've lived here for 13 years now. I worked on the GSL, like Artosis was mentioning, where Dan was mentioning. I also worked on a lot of other tournaments, StarCraft 2 tournaments. I commentated StarCraft Pro League. I commentated the league that became the SSL, which was SpoTV's StarCraft League. I also commentated Heroes of the Storm, Overwatch, before ultimately becoming an LCK commentator, working on what's now the biggest esports tournament here in Korea. I've lived here for a really long time, and there have been times during that stint where I didn't have consistent work because I'm a freelancer. I didn't have a job necessarily. At the end of the year when contract negotiations are happening and tournaments are being formed, there are many years where I was thinking this might be my last year in Korea. But luckily, because the ecosystem here for esports is so good and the infrastructure here for it is so good, there's kind of always something going on. If you work hard enough, you can reach out and get involved in it. So I've been fortunate enough to continue to work out here and commentate the entire time.
You want to hear mine as well? It's not anywhere nearly as interesting or impressive as these guys. So actually, I decided to come to Korea in 2011. My friend was working in Suwon, actually, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, up that way towards Seoul. And so he said, you should come to Korea, you'll love it. And my younger brother, actually, he's the gamer in our family. So he studies, actually, he's graduated from university studying game design. So when he was very little, he was like, they have good games in Korea. And so I was like, okay, I'll go, fine. And I thought I'll stay in Korea for a year, maybe 2, travel. And then, you know, what a cliche, but I met a boy and I fell in love. And now I have 2 children. And I have built a career and a life here in Korea. And one of the reasons that I love it so much is because it is so dynamic and because Koreans are incredibly passionate and so determined to see things right through to the end and do it in the right way. And I love that about the culture. So it's been, you know, a bit of an accident that I arrived here. I was like, okay, but it's absolutely deliberate that I stayed for so long because, like you said, the ecosystem that expands to other industries as well. And it's a fantastic place to live, work, raise children, and do events like this, which is, it brings so many people together from all around the world. It's phenomenal. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and since you, both of you already mentioned a bit about the structure and the ecosystem, how does that compare to the Western world where we come from?
Well, I think that Korea kind of figured out, in terms of esports especially, how to do it early because there was a huge boom in terms of interest in StarCraft tournaments. So, you know, people like Crisis We, who kind of built the OSL, the On-GameNet Star League, that was really popular back in the early 2000s, started in 1999, they had this vision that we could maybe make this big boom of popularity with the rise of PC Bungs into a television show, basically, and turn what used to be considered some niche game tournament where only gamers know about this into something that people could watch on television with their family, with their friends, and getting that onto television in the 2000s. Now, when you think about television, you think, oh, it's not necessarily that important for esports because we have really great live streaming. But in, you know, the year 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, being on television was a really big deal. And I think that it gave a huge amount of legitimacy to gamers, and it made, you know, the older generation think, okay, this is a big deal because it's not just I'm playing in a game tournament. I'm playing in a game tournament on television. I have a lot of fans. I'm very popular, and that sort of infrastructure in Korea existed many, many years before you started to see the rise of popular tournaments that were actually heavily viewed in the West. Because there were tournaments happening at that time that Dan was playing in, for example, in the 2000s in America. and in Europe, but they were not televised. They were not live streamed. Oftentimes they were offline. You had to go to the venue itself to watch them and observe them, and really only the people that were there knew about them. Then the West, I think, is still catching up, and we're seeing a rapid growth in esports with live streaming and the popularity of it, as a lot of people are now getting access to PCs, whereas maybe 10 years ago families couldn't always afford that in different regions. So we're seeing explosive growth, but Korea has this massive head start, and the infrastructure that came with that kind of puts them ahead of the West.
Yeah, and I want to mention also about that, those are good points, but also if you look at the way that Korea has always done it, it's more like a league-based format where you get a lot of content on a very regular schedule, and like you said, it's on TV, so you kind of know where to watch it. It's very accessible, whereas in the West, historically, it's been like very hard to figure out, right? If you're not into esports already, then you're not going to be able to find out where it's at. It's not regularly on TV, or it's not even a regular league a lot of the times. Now, a lot of the West has taken lessons from Korea and made some of these more regular leagues, but still a lot of the esports there is just like one-off tournaments where it's like, oh yeah, there's a big tournament that weekend. But if you're not kind of deep in the scene, it's not something you'll know about as well as you would in Korea, where it's like, yes, Monday through Friday or something is where this league is.
Yeah, there's a certain element of like the infrastructure I was talking about that's built through the big tournaments that existed, and the TV studios that were running it had the funds and the means to have people play in those leagues, especially because Korea is so centralized, especially in Seoul, obviously, where you have players who can live anywhere in Seoul. There could be a team house anywhere in Seoul. You could easily get to that arena. Same thing for the fans who would come to the arena, on those days, Monday to Friday or Wednesday to Sunday, which is more common in esports these days. And so building up those leagues and then having everyone be able to easily get there and travel to it was something that you could do in Korea. But in the West, for example, if you're in the United States or in Europe, you kind of have to go to Katowice and go to where the tournament is there. Everyone has to fly in. If there's a tournament in Los Angeles, for example, everybody has to fly from New York, from Chicago, et cetera, to get to that tournament. And so it's tougher to have those regular leagues until you build the infrastructure in a certain place. Like Dan was saying, we're kind of getting there now a little bit in the US. You have leagues like the LEC in Europe and the LCS in North America, where the teams actually live in a centralized location so they can have those regular leagues. But it took a really long time to build that.
Yeah, you have to give a lot of incentive in the West to get people to move to a certain location so that they're consistently there and they can be on the shows and do all of that. And that's like a huge sacrifice. Whereas even with GSL nowadays, we have players, for instance, that live in Busan and they'll just take the train up to Seoul. It takes like 3 hours and play their match and either go home that night or stay at a friend's house and go home the next day. So I think the population size of Korea plus the length of it, how long it takes to get anywhere, has really helped Korean esports. Whereas if you look at America, for instance, or Canada, it's so spread out. You might have great players on the East Coast, great players on the West Coast, and they really can only come together, for those 1, 2, 3 big events a year.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I've noticed is the fan base, the communities here in Korea, and it goes for everything. It's like K-pop actors, pro players, etc. And I think I even saw like the numbers from the LCK fan base. It's like a majority of women.
I'd say it depends on the game, but oftentimes, yeah, it is majority women, especially in terms of the people who show up to the live events in person and go into the audience. There are fan cafes, like neighbor cafes, which are essentially communities for certain players, for certain teams. And they often work together and collaborate together to lock down when the tickets are going to be sold, and they're able to snatch them up very quickly. So much so that now, like in most esports events in Korea, you actually have to bring your actual ID, your identification with you when you go to enter the arena to prove that you're the person who bought the ticket. There's a lot of reselling of tickets going on, or one person setting up a program to buy 20 tickets and then give them to their friends. But yeah, we call this often like this idol culture in Korea, where the players do end up being idolized. The difference between like idol culture for example, K-pop or the music industry versus the esports industry is it's often about their play, right? How good they are, what they're known for, the things that they'll say in interviews, for example, the stuff that they do on their personal live streams. A lot of people who aren't familiar with esports don't realize that the players do play these televised matches where they go on stage, They play for an hour, they leave, they do an interview, but then they go home and turn on a live stream, either from their team facility or from their actual house, and stream for an hour and talk about what they thought about the game. That's kind of a new trend. But that's where you can get really close with the players or feel like you're close to them watching their live streams. And so there just is this massive fan base of people who do get to see the players' personalities, want to see them in person. They might have the opportunity to go to a fan meet because a lot of these tournaments have a fan meet afterwards where a team will sit down on something like this, where the players can ask or will be asked questions by the fans, or they might sign something for the fans, or even take a photo with them. So in Korea, you do get to be very close with the players. And there's this massive fan culture that's existed since the StarCraft Brood War days as a result.
Yeah, I wanted to wind it a little bit back because you guys came here to Korea when you were pretty young. And I was wondering about the first impressions you had coming like young people from the West, suddenly moving to Korea. First impressions. Laura?
So when I came to Korea, I literally did zero research. I was just like, yeah, let's go. And my first impressions were everything is neon. It was, so I'm from Scotland, and in Scotland, we don't have skyscrapers. We kind of do now, but not really. We don't have neon lights everywhere. And there was just smells that I'd never experienced before. There were roads the size of villages. There was like 10-lane roads, and everything was just so big. And actually, when I first arrived in Korea, maybe 3 days in, I was on my way to my work, and I was standing at the big crosswalks. If you've ever been to Suwon, there's a huge, huge road that comes all the way through. And I was standing at the crosswalk, and a Korean man stood next to me and noticed that I was a foreigner. He said, "Do you know the Beatles?" I was like, "Yes." He's like, "Hey, Jude, don't make..." and started singing "Hey Jude" to me, and the green light came on, and I ran across that 건너편, that 횡단보도 in English, crosswalk. And so it was so culturally different, but I loved it because it was so culturally different, and every day was a new adventure, and that's one of the reasons I love living here still. Every day is a new adventure.
Dan?
Yeah, so when I first moved here, the cultural shock was huge, really. Like, I had watched a lot of Korean esports and everything, but I didn't really know too much about the culture. So I got picked up at the airport and then driven to where I'd live for the next year plus, which was a pro gaming house back in the old StarCraft 1 days. And so as soon as I go in, it's like this huge apartment. There's like 17 pro gamers in there in bunk beds, and the coaches came up to speak to me. And it was one of the funniest experiences I've ever had. Like, one of the coaches came right over, and he just grabbed my stomach, and he wiggled it, and he goes, "You're fat." And I'm just like, wow, this is really straightforward here. This is going to be fun. And, I got to meet them and hang out with them. And, I started learning about the culture. Like, I went and worked at an office when I first moved here every single day. So I'd go into the office very early. I learned about, like, kind of the etiquette of waiting until your boss leaves, until you can leave at the end of the day, and that type of thing. And, just going out to lunch together and the way that works. Like, if the boss is there, suddenly your lunch is paid for. And, it was kind of shocking, but honestly, it was really refreshing. I really loved how kind of straightforward people were with me in a certain way. And I really grew to love it. I mean, I must have, because I stayed here for 14 years, so...
When I first came to Korea, I had some sort of expectations based on the fact that I lived pretty close to essentially K-Town in Atlanta. And so I had a lot of Korean friends. I spoke a little bit of Korean. I mean, very basic phrases, not any fluency at all. But I kind of figured everyone here would speak English because all my Korean friends did. Obviously, they were Korean American, right? When their parents, though, who also I would have expected wouldn't speak any English at all, would speak a decent amount of English. So when I first got off the plane and went to the convenience store and tried to buy water, they told me the price in Korean, and I had no idea what they were saying to me. And I realized very quickly I need to learn Korean as soon as possible. So that was a big goal for me and a big focus for me. Some things that I really enjoyed about Korea when I first moved here were I lived in the suburbs, so when I needed to go get something, go to the grocery store, it's at least a 5-minute drive by car. I didn't live in a city. I didn't live downtown except when I was in university. And even still, like there weren't that many convenience stores. You couldn't just walk 2 minutes down the street and get a coffee or get a water or a snack or something like that. Just how many convenience stores and cafes there were everywhere in Korea. And everyone would have a meeting at a cafe. So if you had to have a business meeting or something, you could just go to a cafe, get a coffee. There was never a moment where people pull out their phones and go, well, where are we going to meet? Where are we going to go? There's always something in Seoul nearby. And beyond that, I remember when I first was moving around the city, I was quite nervous to take the subway because I didn't speak Korean very well. And it seemed like a very large subway map with a million stations compared to my MARTA in Atlanta, which is very easy to traverse. It's just like one line that goes through. And just realizing how clean the subway is, how easy it is to use, how everything is printed in English and in Korean. And if you look at your phone and look at the map, you can figure out basically how to go anywhere in this giant city with 20 million plus people so easily. And it was so exciting to me that I could go anywhere and do anything. The public transportation system is so fantastic and so cheap and affordable that I really just loved the convenience of Korea. Small things like that you don't think about, and if you live here, when you go into a convenience store, you press a button and the door opens. You don't actually have to pull a door open, and things like that really blew my mind when I first moved here.
Yeah, it was the same for me.
I remember getting on a bus and seeing everyone putting cards to like scan their cards so they could take the next bus, and I'm like, what are they doing? Do I need to do that? Am I going to get in trouble? So it was all this new stuff. And you know what? I mean, I guess you'd probably be the same. Don't you wish you could come back with those fresh eyes and experience it all again? Like that feeling has kind of gone now, that new feeling. So yeah, I'm searching for that.
Yeah, and I was wondering, how has things changed in Korea since you first came here and throughout the years?
I mean, things have changed a lot, I think. Like she was just mentioning, sometimes I do feel like I wish I could go back and re-experience things. Sometimes I feel like Korea is it's kind of always been this way, but the older I get, the more I see it. Like a lot of things are run by big companies and big corporations, right? And so sometimes it feels like it's hard to find something that's new or something that is, like someone opens their own restaurant and you found it, you discovered it, and you're like, this is my new favorite restaurant, I really like this. Whenever something like that does happen, it gets posted on a blog and then becomes viral. And then the next time you go to the restaurant, there's 20 people in line before you can go there, that kind of stuff. I think that social media in Korea has really changed the way people discover things and how they do things here. The fact that live streaming is so incredibly popular now means that when we have even crazy political things like what happened 2 days ago happen, or national disasters happen, there are often live streamers who are covering it faster than the official news media. I think Korea has really, really always been at the forefront of tech and at the forefront of building those types of technologies, mobile technologies, social media. But now the technology is so good here that you can pull your phone out and live stream to 10,000 people instantly, anything that's happening faster than what traditional media can cover. And I think as a result, you're seeing a lot of rapid change in Korea right now in the young generation of how they perceive news, how they perceive esports, for example, as well.
One of the big things within the esports industry that I noticed that changed over the years, when I first moved here, everything was very rigid with how they worked with us. I was one of the first two English commentators to move to Korea, and it was like at the very beginning, the bosses would have instructions for us, like, this is very serious, you're going to wear a suit and a tie. And they saw, for instance, when we'd start commentating, if we make a joke and laugh, they were like, why are you joking, or why are you laughing? And they were very strict about certain things, and it was kind of weird because it's like, well, this is it's a video game. In the West, we don't really. It's more about fun and hanging out with your friends and talking about it and things like that. But I did notice over working as a commentator for 14 years, by the end, they kind of became less hands-on. They learned pretty quickly, and the feels like the industry really changed in that way, where they kind of give the English commentators what they need to succeed, so that you can actually just put on a good show, because the audience is just very different, I think, than the Korean audience.
I think for me, I would take it, I mean, obviously not specifically esports, but just in terms of media and broadcasting. And I spent a lot of time in media, and I can see a change in how it's been delivered. Obviously, everybody knows Squid Game, and so the Korean content, so the Korean wave, I guess. I was in Korea when it was already going, and then it kind of had this massive push, and suddenly everybody was talking about Korea. There was kimchi fusion tacos, and there was all of this amazing stuff all over the world. And my friends were saying, "Can you get me anything from Olive Young?" And so there was this desire to find and understand and learn about Korea. And so when I first came, the people the non-Koreans who were there, the foreigners from overseas, were mostly, in my experience, either in certain areas of business and industry, and back in the day, a lot of shipbuilding, and maybe not so much these days, and also English teachers. But now I can see people come to Korea not because they want to make money and then leave 2 years later. They want to learn. They come here having studied Korean in their home countries, and I think Korean is one of, if not the fastest growing popular language to learn, I'm guessing outside of English, but across the world. And so I think I've seen this huge change in how people want to consume Korea and Korean content, and that goes from events like obviously all the esports going on, and we've got K-pop and K-contents and that kind of stuff. So it's been a real shift in the demographic of who and how they want to show up in Korea.
And also, you touched a little bit upon it, but the West is sort of lagging a bit behind, to be honest. What can we do to catch up with Korea?
So there are some good parts about working in Korea in terms of how tournaments are run and how the work culture is for esports specifically. But there are some of these have come with like some cons. So there's pros and cons to this type of thing. For example, in Korea, we don't really take time off that much in esports. Like you're kind of on call 7 days a week. So if something changes in the tournament or something happens, a player is involved in a scandal or a player is injured or something, you need to know about that. You need to be able to react to that quickly. And sometimes changes to the tournament structure or some sort of special broadcast is going to happen gets decided somewhat last minute because everything is moving so fast in Korea. So you're always kind of having to keep your phone with you. You always kind of have to be in touch with your producer and everything that's going on with the tournament and stay up to date. If you think you're going to take like a weekend to put your phone down for 2 days, it doesn't really happen like that in Korea. But I think one of the weaknesses of the West when I was working on, for example, the Overwatch League when I was living in Los Angeles, is that when it's the weekend for them, if you get them on Friday at 5:20 and you need to ask a really important, pertinent question, even for a tournament that's happening on Saturday, they might not get back to you until Monday because they're like, well, it's my weekend. Like it's a difference between the Eastern culture and the Western culture. That's my weekend. Don't bother me. I'm off. I'll talk to you on Monday. But that means that a lot of stuff doesn't get solved quickly as a result. And I think that the Western part of esports probably needs to be a little bit more in touch with that sort of fast-moving culture, because it's the same with the entertainment industry as well. The entertainment industry in the West doesn't take a weekend. They have to respond quickly. And I think that a lot of higher-ups who work in esports now in the West, like in Europe and in America, don't really respect the fact that like this is not really an industry where you can just unplug for a few days during a tournament, for example. You really need to be locked in all the time.
I think another thing that the West could do a bit better that I think Korea has always done very well is kind of making the pros cool and like kind of not exactly superhero-ish, but just something that you look up to and you're like, wow, that's completely awesome. I don't feel like you see that in the Western content. Whereas in Korea, like if you look back, especially to some of these old days with the OGN and the OSL, MSL, all those things, they have these absolutely amazing videos. They have this amazing content where you're seeing these pros and you're seeing, okay, this is kind of the life they lead. This is how hard they're trying. They're kind of making intro videos where they look absolutely awesome. And for me personally, that's what got me hooked. I was like, oh, you can be famous for playing video games and everyone knows who you are and you make a boatload of money and get sponsors and stuff. That's great. Whereas I feel like a lot of the tournaments in the West, they don't focus as much on the pros. It's more about the tournament itself. And I feel like that's to their own detriment.
I want to just add, like, it's about creating a good narrative, a good story, right? You want to create a story that people can relate to. And I agree. That's what also got me interested in Korean esports.
I think there's a certain bias that I have towards what Dan is talking about, because that's also really what got me into esports. And I still watch those old videos from the early 2000s from time to time because they're so cool. And I kind of grew up with that as my Korean esports background. And we still have those types of videos today at the LCK, for example. Every season we have a really cool new opening video that tells the story and the lead up to like what was happening before this tournament, who's the popular player, who's the best, how many championship rings do they have on their hand. When I try to bring these concepts to the West and talk to Western producers about, hey, why don't you make a video like this, they kind of look at me and go, don't you think that's a little cringe? Don't you think that's a little bit lame? And I think that there is a certain element of that to a lot of Westerners, that they don't think that's cool. They do think it's kind of lame. I don't, and I grew up with it, right? So for me, I think there's a personal bias there. But I do think there is a middle ground that could be reached where putting the players front and center and doing content with them that the producer thinks is not cringe, but any sort of content that puts them at the center and not the big graphic that says prize pool $400,000. Like, that's not really, I think, what makes people interested in esports. It's learning these players' personalities, where they're from, what they like, and what their unique play style is, and how that translates to maybe their personality. That sort of thing I think we definitely can see more of in the West, and we need to see more of if they want to keep up with Korea, because Korea is all about legacy in esports. What's your legacy? What's your career? What are your achievements? What have you accomplished? And I think that in the West, it's sometimes just like, he won the last tournament, and that's like, and he made this much money, and that's kind of where it stops. And I think we need to see more of like what Dan is talking about.
Yeah, and the legacy thing is huge. That's actually a great word for it as well. If you look, like, all of the longest running tournaments in the world are Korean. If you look at like just the amount of broadcast time, all of these dwarf anything in the West. So they've been able to build that storyline, and they've kept that storyline alive, and they've kind of built upon it. And sometimes they pull from those older tournaments to make these great videos and these great pieces that center on the players. And I feel like I can't imagine, a producer in the West saying that something like that is cringe, because that's like a cringe take that's cringe.
Yeah.
That will literally, if you do something like that and it catches someone's mind, like, you're going to have an esports fan for life there.
Yeah, and where do you see it going in the future? Because especially for casters and commentators, we're seeing a change now. It's moving away from that, and they're starting to use more and more streamers instead in co-streaming. What are your thoughts on that?
So in Korea, we have this similar sort of co-stream meta, so to speak, where even in the LCK or the ASL, or now the SSL, the StarCraft Brood War tournament that's very popular here, you have an official broadcast, but you also have people who basically restream it. So they put the screen on their live stream, and then they put their camera in the corner and they talk over it. And it's something that's affected a lot of commentators because, while some of these co-streamers started very small, nowadays often have more viewers than the actual live broadcast itself. And that can be true of the LCK with somebody like Wolf, who's a pro gamer, same name as me, but who streams LCK and sometimes gets more viewers than the LCK itself. There are strengths and weaknesses to this, because it means that the narrative isn't controlled by the official broadcast. Sometimes a player might say or a streamer, ex-player, for example, might say something disparaging about players or about the tournament there, which can hurt the league. So there's not a lot of control right now about this. I think it's a bit Wild West, but everyone who is seeing those numbers go up is learning that this is a reality that we're living in. When you could double your broadcast numbers by having a co-streamer that's as popular and as famous as the league itself on their channel, that means you can use those numbers and sell that to sponsors. So what it means for commentators oftentimes is you feel a little bit less secure about your job, because the guy who's just going to be able to say what he wants, curse on stream, and do literally whatever he wants, run around and scream and have fun, that draws a lot of younger viewers, whereas we're trying to be a little bit more professional. We still make jokes like Dan was talking about earlier, and we still have a fun time. We're kind of having a more chill atmosphere oftentimes in esports broadcasts here in Korea. But there are limits to what you can do and what you can say when you're on the official broadcast, and you're, as a commentator, often competing with people who have no limitations whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that it certainly has hurt the professional commentator industry, but I don't think that that's going to necessarily go away. As you mentioned, it increases viewership so much, and when you look at the balance of like, okay, the main production, you have all the production costs, the prize money, and all this, and you have to pay your commentators and the people that are producing them. It's very expensive. And then you have a guy in his basement getting more viewership than that. And that obviously can be a little bit frustrating, but I think you still need the base show in there as well. You can't just make the content and send out a stream and expect people to pick it up. And I think that the professional commentators have a very important place in helping new viewers come in, right? Like once you become a very seasoned veteran, you might be like, oh, I want the pro's perspective, so you go watch his stream. But if you're new to it, you're going to have a more kind of like developed, straightforward show with the commentators, which is important. But I don't know where this will end up for commentators, because certainly it makes the commentators worth a little bit less, because if you're just going purely for viewership and not necessarily the quality of the content, that is going to hurt the commentating industry, and it has to some degree.
I think as well, just to add to that, from what I see with a lot of other content across the board, you see the same thing. It's commentary on top of commentary on top of commentary. And I was really, like, we were discussing this kind of a little bit yesterday at dinner. What kind of limitations are put on you as commentators, because we're in Korea? And for me, certainly, if you're on the radio or if you're on television, there's certain things you can say, and there's certainly a lot of things that you just definitely must not say. So do you find that that's a cultural difference, or I'm just curious?
So for me, I find that the Korean broadcast is quite restrictive, but I think it's a cultural thing more than the broadcast, the Korean language producer saying, I want you specifically to not mention these things. And there's a line that's kind of drawn for the Korean side in terms of if a player makes a mistake, you have to acknowledge it, right? You can't pretend like it didn't happen. But they don't say like what we might say on the English stream, like this is an uncharacteristically bad performance from this player. This might be his worst game of a year he's ever had, or something like that. Whereas I don't think that that the Korean broadcast would actually necessarily say that. We often even suggest on the English stream of the LCK that maybe a player should be subbed out because of their performance. We're very honest. And in the past, Korean producers would come to me after I would say something like that, or my colleagues would say something like that, and they'd be like, don't you think you're being a little harsh? Like, I don't think you should say stuff like that. But now we have a lot of freedom. But it's very common for me to, when a broadcast is over, after we've really, on the English stream, gone in on somebody who's really having a poor performance, or been like, oh, they want to forget this game, that's for sure. And they go into the green room changing with the Korean commentators, and they're like exploding all of their emotions and talking about how they feel about the game, because they really couldn't go fully in on the Korean language broadcast. But that also opens up the floor for co-streamers, for example, who aren't really restricted by that, to be extremely honest, right? And that could be frustrating as a Korean commentator when somebody is saying the truth you feel that you wish you could say, but isn't necessarily appropriate for you to say on an official league broadcast.
Yeah, and I mentioned before, I feel like there's been much less censorship the later we've gotten over the years. Like at the very beginning for some of the early televised things, there was a lot of instructions like don't say any website names that aren't our website, or don't talk about this player that got banned for cheating, or all sorts of things like that have popped up over the years, even to the point where they're like, use this ID for this player, and then the player joins the game and they're on a different ID. So there have been some really funny, harsh rules. And of course, if you're a co-streamer or something, you can just say anything you want. That's not going to get you kicked off of the platform, and you're going to be fine. But as time has progressed, I feel like, especially over with Africa TV working on GSL and ASL and all of that, I feel like they really let the reins off, and as they develop a relationship with English commentators, you can they know what you're going to do for the most part, and that how to stay professional while still kind of giving the flair that you need to give to entice viewers to watch.
Yeah, it's changing, right?
There are some things still to this day that on the LCK broadcast we are told not to acknowledge or talk about. And I won't mention them, but there are obviously some scandals that have occurred, which if you've looked at the last, I can mention them here, but I won't. But there are certain scandals or certain things that have come up where we are aware of what happened behind the scenes, and there's a narrative that exists to the public, and they don't want to mention any of it because it's like not necessarily true, like the PR that's come out about a certain situation, and they're very careful about that. And I find that type of line that's drawn on what teams want to do to protect a player, for example, or to protect their image, is something that I'm okay with the league telling me to not say or to say, because it could affect the reputation of the league as well. So you do have to draw some lines because you want the league to continue to be popular, and you don't want any scandals to come through. You don't want to lose sponsors, because sponsors are a huge part of what keeps the lights on at these big tournaments. So when you're a co-streamer, I think what could be the end of co-streaming, what could really affect co-streaming in the future, is those disparaging remarks I mentioned earlier. If a person says something negatively about the league, or accidentally is about a sponsor, or is drinking a competitor, during the tournament, if there's an energy drink sponsor but they're drinking a competitor's energy drink on their stream. Right now, there's not a whole lot of restrictions about that kind of stuff, but I think there will be, because you're using those same viewership numbers for the co-stream for your sponsors, so they have to follow those sorts of rules. And I think right now people really aren't. But as sponsors kind of wise up to this and start looking at these co-streams, they may have to kind of get pulled back a little bit.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true. Does anyone have any questions to some of these people? Boban has a question. Boban always has questions.
Maybe we get a mic for him.
Yeah, or you can borrow mine.
Thank you. So all this, let's call it migration, esports migration or entertainment migration, east to west, west to east. Where do you think that the balance is more? Did the east bring more to the west, or the east wouldn't have brought that to the west if the west wasn't coming here to actually digest all the things that are happening here in the east and then take that back to the west?
Yeah, I think if you look far back in the history of esports, like we did have some early competitive gaming that was kind of esports-esque in America, for instance, with like Quake way back in the day, some Counter-Strike things with CPL and everything. But really, Korea started off esports with StarCraft. StarCraft 1 was so huge, and that did kind of infiltrate to the West, and everyone saw how cool that was. And I think that is really where it started. And I really think that Western esports didn't get a good footing until StarCraft 2 came out. So obviously that is a huge take from the Korean scene.
Yeah, and to add on to that, it's weird to say this, but I think I have to be a little bit brutally honest. I feel like the main thing the West brought to esports was publishing the games. And even that, you can't give full credit to Blizzard necessarily for making StarCraft into an esport. They made a fantastic game, and they allowed it to be competitive. Like, it was built to be multiplayer and competitive, but they never had any intent of making a game that would be broadcast and televised. And I think a lot of the publishers didn't even know that it was getting broadcast in the early days of StarCraft Brood War until much later, as it started to become huge. But the West did make fantastic games that were able to be competitive, even if they weren't intentionally made that way, to be used the way that they are. And then the East, and Korea specifically, took those games and made them into this incredible thing. And then the West has since kind of then emulated Korean esports. Like Dan mentioned, it didn't stick in the West. They saw it was sticking in Korea, and then they're like, let's kind of emulate what Korea is doing.
Thank you.
Hi. So rather than actually it's a question, it's a comment. I mean, the East, of course, predominantly has always, and Korea in itself has been, let's say, a big supporter of Go for a long, long time. So similarly in China, they've got Chinese chess, Shangxi, or they've got Weiqi and so on. So the East is very dominant, let's say, in respecting mind sports. And for us, I would say that's a very fundamental point. So esports had a good, let's say, birthplace in Korea because already the cultural aspects of Korea, including China, including Japan, are open towards mind sports. Whereas in the West, we find it always a huge challenge, particularly the United States, United Kingdom, where traditional games like chess are considered games, not sports. And consequently, you cannot make a profession out of it. So esports suffers from the same, let's say, dilemmas that other traditional sports. Chinese chess is non-existent. In China, you've got games like Mahjong, which has a following of about 800 million people. So even the numbers are non-comparable to any other mind sport. If you talk about Xiangqi, it's about 600 million people in China. That's Chinese chess. If you talk about Weiqi, it's 200 million. One time I was speaking with their chess, the normal chess, the international chess people, and I said, how big is chess in China? And they said, no, we're very small. And they said, how big is chess in China? And they said, we have about 20 million players. So the numbers are just completely different. In the West don't total in any numbers, even if I take all the mind sports together, they don't total anywhere close to what one of these individual sports does in the East. So the culture is different. So you're lucky that Korea was already, let's say, positive towards this sort of development. When I visited Korea the first time, maybe 16 years ago, they had 2 channels dedicated to Go. And I mean, nobody...
They still do, yeah.
Nobody has this in the world, So it's a very specific culture, and that helps to breed such developments.
I do agree. I think that Korea's culture for esports also came along. Dan mentioned living in a pro gaming house. That was like a concept that people didn't even think about in the U.S. because we've talked about before. Everyone lives so far away. The country is so large. Moving to California as like a 16-year-old to live in a gaming house with 8 people and try to train and get better wasn't really a thing, but that type of training mentality existed in Korea. It's interesting you mentioned Mahjong, for example. I don't know if anyone here plays Mahjong. It's one of the hardest games to learn, I feel, for a Westerner, because it's so insanely complex, and the rules that you have to know and memorize to play Mahjong, which I've learned to play actually last year, very difficult. But StarCraft Brood War is only popular in Korea as an esport right now. And StarCraft Brood War is one of the most technically difficult and mechanically challenging games to play. Your wrists will actually feel pain if you play at the highest level for several hours. So you actually have to take care of your wrists. But because StarCraft Brood War is so popular in Korea and everyone played it at such a young age, and the culture of it being on television and everything, like Mahjong, like Go, you mentioned, exists here in Korea, people still play it. People still enjoy watching it. But if you're a 14-year-old, you're probably not going to pick up the game. Just like if you're a 14-year-old American, you're probably not going to play Mahjong because it's so complex. It's so difficult to get into. But you can watch StarCraft Brood War and appreciate it. I think people overall don't do that as much outside of Korea, whereas it's still extremely popular in Korea because of that history and that legacy. So I like to make that comparison sometimes with like StarCraft Brood War and a game like Mahjong or Go. Seems easy from the concept of it, but when you actually sit down and try to do it, it's insanely complex.
Yeah, and I think everything being on TV and kind of popular over here definitely helped with that. I can say that 20 years ago when I'm training hard to come to Korea, in the West, this was completely unheard of. My mother thought I had video game addiction and would take my keyboard away and, things like that. She didn't understand that this is actually a real thing. It's on TV. It is a career that I can do. And that's definitely a part of what the West needs to work on. I think they have since then. In the last 20 years, it's definitely come along a lot.
One observation that I could possibly add to that is that the amount of PC bang or PC rooms in Korea is absolutely substantial. And for anyone who perhaps has never been to a PC bang, they've improved since that's also changed since I first came to Korea. But PC bangs are literally large spaces filled with PCs, rows and rows and rows of PCs. And so for people who, like you said earlier, maybe didn't have the economic strength to be able to go and get a PC for the household, you were having kids who could go to the PC bang and play games after school with their friends. And so it's a culture thing. And that exists for norebang, for singing songs. When DVDs were a thing, you could have a DVD bang. So you could go and watch movies in a room, and they were all over every neighborhood. And so I think infrastructurally, the software that was implemented into neighborhoods made it very accessible for kids and grown-ups and anybody to just jump into a PC Bang. It was very affordable, and you had an hour of gaming for 2001. So it was, why wouldn't you go there? You could eat ramen. It was like a social exercise, and Korea does, although admittedly probably unaware. I'm also in the wellness business. I'm a wellness company owner, and Korea has such strength in social wellness. Because of the social community aspect of how they just navigate, day-to-day life. And so I think this was a huge part of it as well, being able to enjoy your friends at PC Bang after school. And that's been a huge part of it, I believe.
Yeah, it's crazy. In the late 90s, early 2000s, going to a PC Bang would cost like 400 or 500 won, at certain places, depending on where you lived. So you could actually go and play the game that you saw on TV and then start to train even if you didn't own a computer at your house, because it was insanely cost prohibitive at the time to do so. So that's an incredibly big point that I think people don't talk about when they talk about the kind of the birth of popular games in Korea, like StarCraft 1, but also games like League of Legends that were still insanely popular in PC Bangs 10, 12 years ago.
And just to put this in perspective, if you go to a similar like PC cafe in America, if you want to play all day here, when I moved here in 2008, I might pay $8 to $10 to play all day long, like a ridiculous amount that I shouldn't have even played. But if you were to do that in America, I mean, that might cost you $80. And that's something that you don't walk in and see kids playing at PC cafes in North America, whereas in Korea all the time, like they come out of school, they're in school uniform still playing. That doesn't exist.
I have a question, actually, out of curiosity. Does the PC Bangs in NA actually work? Because at least in the Nordic countries, in Norway, it doesn't really work.
So in my experience with the US, it's kind of like a niche thing that you do because you almost want to have the cultural experience of it. Like where I grew up, there's a few PC Bangs because it's kind of a K-town area. So it's run by Koreans, actually. And if you see Westerners in there, it's because they kind of heard about PC Bangs from watching, something like this and hearing about them because you couldn't see them. And then you'd go and you can order ramyun there, and it's kind of a cultural experience. But otherwise, you don't really see them in West unless it's like a dream hack, like a big LAN. And it's not even really a PC Bang then, but it's a similar experience. Just simply because you're not living in a dense city in most of the world to where you could just walk down the street from your office or your school to go to one. You need to get in a car and go somewhere, so it just doesn't functionally work the same way.
I think I saw them starting to pop up before I left for Korea. So in Scotland, but it wasn't like a PC Bang. It was a cafe that you had to go in and buy something, and then you could use the computer. And so you would have booths, and people would be there sending an email or checking, surfing AOL and checking out games. But it wasn't for that specific, it didn't have a purpose. It was like, look what we've got in our cafe. It was more this kind of new idea of being able to work and have a coffee in the same place at the same time.
Yeah, time is wrapping up soon. I want to ask one last question for each of you. So if you have one advice to give to anyone who wants to come here and work in either esports or any other area, what would that be?
I get messages probably at least twice a week of people sending me something on Twitter or my public email saying, I want to work in Korean esports. Like, where can I work? I think people just want to believe that you can just simply come to Korea and then start working. My advice is work on something, build a skill, and have a resume, and have proof that you can actually, that you have a strength in a certain field. And then, even though you're a Westerner, even though you don't speak Korean, there are jobs out here that you can do, but you need to actually build a skill. I think a lot of people just see esports on TV and they're like, I want to work on that. I would like to be involved in that. Please just hire me. To do what? Well, I'll figure it out. No, you actually have to have a skill. You have to build a skill and then contact me and we could talk, So that's the most common thing that happens is people just ask me, I want to move to Korea and work. Build your skill first.
Yeah, that's a great point. And specifically on commentator, which is our kind of main gigs that we have, you have to also have a lot of flexibility. You know, I'm mostly known as a StarCraft commentator, but during my time in Korea, I probably casted professionally like 20 different games over the years. And you just have to kind of be able to work with whatever they want. You know, like Wolf was mentioning at the very beginning of the show, there are definitely times where there's no work because you're a contractor and then something pops up. And you have to be able to be flexible enough to take that work. So like if you come to Korea, generally you're not just going to get a gig like you know, the LCK and have that pay for your entire life. It's going to be more piecemeal where you're doing a lot of different games, you're flexible, maybe you're doing some voiceover work for, you know, we've all done stuff like that out here as well. And you can go kind of to the side of esports as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be only esports work. There's like voiceover work and little commercial type things that you can do as well.
I would add to that, I actually got one of those emails yesterday. I would add to that maybe 4 key points. Like you said, make yourself valuable to the market. Nobody cares about your feelings, right? You got to make yourself valuable to the market. You've also got to just have the passion to learn the language. And I know that you don't have to learn the language, but you will be able to get so many more opportunities if you're willing to learn at least basic Korean, because that transitions into my next point. The cultural aspects of living in Korea are far more important than the language. So if you can understand, if you can build cultural fluency, you have like this kind of superpower against, you know, the things that are going to come flying your way. Nunchi, for example, we were talking about that yesterday. So you got to understand the culture. And then finally, network. You got to speak to people, you got to talk to people. If you want something, ask for it. Find the person who can, you know, be the one to give you the advice and say, I would love to hear your advice. What's the worst he can say? No? Okay, next person.
Yeah, I think those are all very good advices, and I would agree also. We talked a lot about this yesterday. Any final words you want to add before we're finished?
Oh, this is a really fun panel. I actually really enjoyed it. I think we have, you know, really unique perspectives, and you know, with the 3 of us here to talk about it, especially with what you're doing in terms of like radio broadcasts and stuff like that as well, mentioning the culture. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and if you have more questions after, just come and ask them. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm going to ask our panelists and our lovely moderator to stay seated. Can we give a huge round of applause, please, for our fantastic moderator and our panelists as well, and for your questions. Thank you very much for your questions and comments. All right, let's take a short break. Let's stretch our legs, let's stretch our bodies, and we'll be back at 12 p.m. for our next session, Korea's Secret Sauce. We'll see you soon.